Well, the World Championships are well in the books at this point. We just finished up Pittsburgh Regionals over this last weekend, so you might think that the tier list for Obsidian Flames is pretty much sewn up at this point. Looks a little bit like this, doesn't it? No, I think you're actually wrong. You see, there's one deck in this image that jumps out at me because it is much, much better than its position would indicate. And that's Inteleon. Seriously, this deck is really good. We need to get more people playing this deck. It needs to have more than 155 points this season. But the other deck that I want to look at is also not Hisui and Gudra as much as I'd like it to be. None of that today. Now, instead, today we're going to focus in on a deck that I think goes faster, hits harder, and is way more consistent than at least 4 decks above it on this list, and that's Miraidon EX. As you can see, Miraidon currently sits at a paltry 2.73% of the meta. Ouch, and I personally believe that number needs to at least triple. This is easily one of the better decks in the entire format right now, but no one seems to be taking it seriously. Yeah, very bold claim, and I understand that. So allow me to back it up with a couple of stats real quick before we look at an actual deck list. Now, there's the 21st place finish at Worlds that a lot of us are aware of by now. Andrew Mahoney did a good job of piloting the deck, but couldn't quite get it there. Now, it also finished 30th at Worlds, in case you're interested and didn't already know that. But if you want some slightly more impressive sounding stat lines in terms of finishes, there was the 8th and 13th place finishes at the Asia EN Open in July, and maybe the most impressive and most recent results for the deck are the 2nd and 6th place finishes at Pittsburgh Regionals just this past week. Now, there are some other results I think are important that I want to get to later in the video, but for now, I'm going to put them in my pocket, circle back around to them at the end. Now, I think it's important to go ahead and take a look at this deck and discuss exactly why it's been doing so well lately. But before we even highlight a single card in this thing, I think I should point out that one of the reasons it's doing so well is because people don't respect it enough. I think that is helping the deck to a degree. It's possible that some people just don't even bother to learn this matchup because they think they don't have to. And it's also possible that some of the people doing their due diligence don't put enough time into learning this matchup, instead focusing on things like, Mew and Guardy and Lost Zone Box and stuff, and just not really putting in a whole lot of games against Miraidon. So I do think, again, that is boosting the deck some. But let's go ahead and dive into the deck now and talk about how it attacks the meta. Now, to be honest with you, not a whole lot has actually changed since this deck was first introduced, but what pieces are new are incredibly important, and I will get to them, but first I'm going to start with some of the main pieces in this deck, because I know there are going to be people in the audience that have never even seen these cards, because a lot of them are going to be coming over from the Magic the Gathering channel that I also run. So just in case you've never seen Miraidon or Pokemon cards in your life, let's talk about what Miraidon EX, the deck's namesake, actually does. This is a 220 HP basic EX Pokemon with a retreat cost of just 1, and it's got Photon Blaster, 3 energy, 220 damage, but it can't attack during the next turn. That is not as bad as it looks. There's plenty of ways to switch this out with something else, or just have 2 Miraidons going, or some other main attacker like Raikou or Raichu or whatever. So don't worry about not being able to attack next turn. There are lots of ways around it, and very often if you go second, you can attack on your first turn for 220 damage with this, and a little bit of ramp in the deck. But it's also got Tandem Unit. This is the other most important part of this card. Tandem Unit just basically allows you to, once per turn, search your deck for up to 2 basic lightning Pokemon, put them onto your bench, then shuffle your deck. Really broken ability in terms of developing your bench, which is something this deck wants to do, because it also plays Raikou V and a couple of other important benchy cards, but Raikou, most important of all of them. Raikou's a basic V Pokemon with 200 HP and a retreat cost of 1. It's got Lightning Rondo. This is just 2 energy, very easy to attack with it on turn 1, with a full bench too. This attack does 20 more damage for each bench Pokemon of both yours and your opponents, so it can do a total of 220 damage for just 2 energy. And again, if you've gone second and your opponent has developed their bench to any degree on the first turn, it's fairly easy to take knockouts with this. But it's also got Fleet-Footed. Just draw a card once during your turn, so long as the Pokemon's in the active slot. Very good ability. Now, the other main attacker in this deck is Raichu V, but it doesn't attack all the time. This is a 200 HP basic V Pokemon with a retreat cost of just 1, like most of the other Pokemon in the deck. It's got Fast Charge for a lightning energy. If you go first, you can use it on your first turn. You go search your deck for a lightning energy and attach it to the Raichu. But most often you're going to be using Dynamic Spark. This is 2 lightning energy for 60 times something. What's that? You may discard any amount of lightning energy from your Pokemon. You do 60 damage for each card you discarded this way. So it's Chin-Pal's attack just with lightning energy instead. Obviously a pretty good attack, especially later on in the game when you've been able to Electric Generator and Dynamotor. We'll talk about that in just a second. A bunch of energy onto stuff, and this can just take huge knockouts somewhat late, but even in the mid game a lot of the time. Now, the actual engine behind this deck is Mareep and Flaffy. Mareep's not that important, but the one I play has 70 HP. This is not the one most people play, but this is a little bit harder to snipe off the bench with a Sableye and still kill something else. So I just think 70 HP makes it better than a lot of the other Mareeps, but the important one is Flaffy here. Flaffy's a 90 HP stage 1 Pokemon, has Electro Ball, does 50 damage, who cares? It got Dynamotor is the important part of this card. Once during your turn, you may attach an energy card, or lightning energy specifically, from your discard pile to one of your benched Pokemon. Now, controversial take here a little bit, but I actually don't think that Flaffy is the most important ramp card in the deck, but it is a very important card in the deck, and there's a reason why earlier on in the season, these electric Miraidon decks, whatever, kind of waffled back and forth between playing Flaffy and not playing Flaffy, and now every single one of them do, because it was decided that Flaffy is that good. It might die to a Greninja along with something else, but like, who cares? It is important to have this thing out as early as turn 2, because over the course of the game, it'll be responsible for 3, 4, 5 ramp if the game keeps going on. This does accomplish an awful lot. This really helps out with those turn 1 going second attacks when you just attach an energy to Raikou, fill out your bench, and then use Flaffy to get an energy out of your discard pile that you discarded with something else, an Ultra Ball, Professor's Research, whatever. Other known tech in the core of the deck includes a bunch of cards I've already talked about, like Electric Generator, the actual best ramp piece in the deck in my opinion. Look at the top 5 cards of the deck. Attach up to 2 basic lightning energy you find there to your benched lightning Pokemon in any way you like. On turn 1, this does an awful lot to get you attacking, especially alongside a switch effect or a cheap retreat, which the deck specializes in. Other cards I've already mentioned that I should probably bring up are things like Professor's Research, pretty normal card, but this deck really needs as much of this effect as it can get. That's why it's playing 4, and other cards like it. But there's also Ultra Ball, which does allow you to discard those energies and kind of turn them into value with the Flaffy. So great card for the deck, helps you find that Miraidon turn 1, and then Miraidon will go get anything else that you might need. I guess the Ultra Ball can go and find the one-of Zeraora that we're playing in the deck. This is mostly as a pivot because it has 0 retreat cost, but it's also a 1 prize. If you have to sacrifice 1, it's better than sacking a 2 prize, obviously, and it can do some damage, but if you're attacking with it, you're probably doing it wrong. But I guess besides that, the Ultra Ball can also go and get the Squawkabilly, which is kind of hard to get otherwise. You do really want this on turn 1 for fairly obvious reasons if you've read the card, because once during your first turn, you may discard your hand and draw 6 cards. I guess if you really have to, you can use the Motivate attack for just a single energy and kind of do an impression of Dynamotor, but again, if you're attacking with Squawkabilly, you are kind of doing it wrong. Now, mostly what we want this for is to find Miraidons and other basic Pokemon to fill our bench out and whatnot on turn 1, but especially we want Electric Generator on turn 1. We want to be able to get Flaffy as early as possible, so we're looking for that. We want to get Forest Seal Stones and put them onto our Pokemon and search for whatever we want after that. We even want to get Bravery Charms as early in the game as possible. So Squawkabilly, super important for shoring up the early game, making sure we get not only all the Pokemon, but all the energy on them that we want. Again, with cards like Electric Generators can be very important. Quickly going over some of the other cards in the deck, we've got a whole 3 of Boss's Orders in this beast. A lot of decks in the format will play 2 right now, but it can be very important for this deck to be able to attack what it wants to attack, because it can usually knock something out, but it's not always the thing in the active. So Boss's Orders is very important to this deck. It plays the whole 3 of. It's amazing. It's also got 2 copies of Escape Rope in here, as well as 2 copies of Switch cards, so it can have as many switch effects as possible for those turns when that free retreat or even that 1 energy retreat just isn't possible. There's a Nest Ball in here for when you want your Miraidon early game, and more likely for when you want your Squawkabilly in the early game. That 1 Nest Ball will help with that, but you don't need to play too many more. There's also 2 copies of Iono and 2 copies of Judge. We'll get to why in just a second when we talk about the most important new card in this deck. Aside from that, there's Bravery Charm. There's even an Arven in the deck to go get the Bravery Charm and also go get an Electric Generator, which is really important, obviously. But Bravery Charm, super important for this deck. It turns a lot of would-be one-shots into 2-shots, which just extends the game. If we can just get 2 hits on a lot of Pokemon in the format, we can kill them. Bravery Charm turns our Pokemon into 2 hits for a lot of Pokemon in the format. You cannot imagine how much this will swing the game. Bravery Charm is actually, amazingly, one of the most important new technologies this deck has been running in the last month and a half. Surprisingly, Bravery Charm helps shore up the Lost Zone box matchup a good bit, which is not something I would have thought when I first saw the card in the deck, but if you want some anecdotal proof of this, go watch Jesse Parker pilot the deck in the finals of Pittsburgh Regionals and really put the Lost Zone box player, who did end up taking the match, don't get me wrong, but he put them on their back foot with this card a couple of times in that match, because they can't just double Sableye or double Cramorant or Miraidon. It makes their job a lot harder. It's already difficult sometimes for Lost Zone box to take out these high HP Pokemon in just 1 or even 2 shots, and this makes 2 shots into 3 shots against that deck, really shoring up that matchup, and it needed help there. But the final card in the deck, and maybe the most important of the new technologies, is Path to the Peak. The deck has only played this card for a little over a month now. This build is even being called a control build by some players, because the actual idea behind this card is to slap down Miraidon turn 1, use the ability Tandem Unit before you throw down Path to the Peak, and then you can path into a Judge, most likely. You can also do this with Iona or whatever, but mostly what you're trying to do is throw down Path to the Peak against Mew, Chien-Pao, even Lost Zone box, because it shuts down things like Greninja. Remember, Path to the Peak shuts down Radiant Pokemon, that they do in fact have a rule box, it turns out. But yeah, this shuts down a ton of opposing decks, and once you play Judge, it's going to cut off a lot of their options for dealing with your game plan, because they get only 4 cards. Judge will also take certain cards out of their hand, like that Baxcalibur they couldn't evolve yet, or maybe the energy they couldn't attach yet in their Chien-Pao deck because they don't have Baxcalibur yet. So maybe they Shivery Chilled, got a couple of energy, there's still some in their hand. You get what I'm getting at here. So especially against Chien-Pao, this shuts them down, but it also does similar things to decks like Mew and a bunch of other piles in this format. For instance, if you wanted to shut down Charizard and Pidgeot EX, this does that too. So Path to the Peak, although it looks like it hurts us a little bit, we really don't need to use Miraidon's Tandem Unit ability more than once or twice in a game. We often don't even need to use Raikou's ability more than a couple times in a game, especially once we have the Path Lock in play. So really, really sweet card, great addition to the deck, and I'm a little surprised that it took so long for the deck to evolve into this shape, but it has been playing like this for about a month or 6 weeks at this point, and I just think that a lot of people don't respect Miraidon anymore because they're used to the old version that just tried to go fast and do that pretty much at all costs. But in this case, you have a deck with Squawkabilly, for instance, and electric generators and flappies that can go fast. This is a ramp deck, but it's also kind of a control deck with things like Path to the Peak and Judge, right? Forest Sealstone going and getting whatever you need for the situation. Bravery Charm, making the 2 shots into 3 shots and whatnot. Boss's Orders as a 3 of. Again, this plays an awful lot like a control deck for an aggro deck. So really interesting sort of mix of styles here. Just being able to get Path to the Peak down allows us to do a lot of stuff. Actually, it's not that we get to do a lot. It's that our opponent doesn't get to do anything, and that really helps a ramp deck. But let's just say I haven't talked you into it yet. Even after all that, you still don't feel like you should respect this deck. Well, soon, I think you're going to be forced to, because there are a number of Japanese tournaments where 151 is already legal to play, where this deck has been doing very, very well in a slightly altered form with some cards that really help it out in a couple of important matchups. And when I say the deck has been doing well in Japanese tournaments, I mean pretty consistently. There's this deck, there's this deck, there's this deck. I'm going to stop on one of these eventually. There's this deck. These decks have been winning at least gym challenges and even up in terms of the level of tournaments that it's being entered in. Pretty recently here, as people are putting together cards like the new Mew EX and slapping them in the deck, as well as maybe the most important new card for the deck. We'll talk about Mew EX in a second, but I really want to talk about Zapdos EX. This was in my top 10 sleepers for 151 video, and I think it's basically at this point, after these results, been confirmed to be a good card in this set, especially for these Miraidon decks, which I don't think surprises anybody. Now, specifically, this is yet another card that is very good in the Lost Zone box matchup. This deck already has plenty of ways to attack on turn 1, going second with a Miraidon, and that takes 3 energy, so it is really feasible. Not within the realm of impossibility whatsoever to attack with the Zapdos on turn 1, and at that point against Lost Zone box, you're doing 120 damage to the active and taking out whatever's sitting there. And you're doing 90 to the bench, which is going to kill something. A Comfey, a Sableye, whatever they got lurking around on the bench. So being able to 2-prize Lost Zone box on the first turn of the game and take out Comfeys, basically just handicapping them for the rest of the game, that's probably going to win a lot of matchups just by itself. Now, most of these decks only play the one of Mew EX, but that makes plenty of sense. It's not an electric Pokemon. A lot of the cards in the deck are reliant on specifically targeting electric Pokemon, right? But Mew is just one of those cards that you're going to see in a lot of decks moving forward because it attacks for colorless energy. It's just a very good Pokemon. It is a bit reliant on what your opponent is doing, but really there aren't any bad decks in the format at this point. I mean, there are some, but especially in the top echelon of the format, there are maybe 8 very good, very playable decks right now. So almost no matter what you're up against, you're going to be able to attack with a good attack against your opponent's Pokemon so long as you have the Mew out. So this card is showing up in an awful lot of things. It is not specific to the Miraidon decks, but it does help the Miraidon deck out with a number of important matchups. So there you have it. I hope maybe I was able to convince you here to respect Miraidon right now, but even if you're not going to do that, in a couple of weeks, again, I think you're basically going to have to. Now, if you enjoyed this video, do all the YouTube stuff. Like, subscribe. I'm trying to get to enough watch time to monetize the channel at this point. We have hit 1,000 subs, but I still need a little bit of watch time. So, put this on, go to sleep, whatever, help you dude out. But in any case, I just appreciate that you're here. Thanks for all the new subs recently. It means a lot to me. In case you want to know, our next video is going to be the Obsidian Flames tier list, and we're going to try to get that out well before 151 drops in the States. But as soon as 151 drops, we'll have plenty of content in terms of that. So we'll talk about all the decks in that format and blah, blah. It's going to be fun. Just make sure you sub for all that. But for now, I gotta get out of here. Just let me know in the comments section what decks you think no one respects, and they should. Again, I think that Hisuian Gudra and Inteleon are definitely on that list somewhere, but if you got something else you want to talk about, let me know, Chin Pao players, how you feel down there in the comments section. But for now, I'm gonna get out of here. Thanks for watching, everybody.